Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and I think this is a perfect opportunity because you see there is a channel that I already like very much called Leonidas Sparta. As I said already in a previous upload, fantastic channel, link in the description, check him out. And he made a response video to me, which is this one here. Now we're gonna check out a couple of clips from this video, but in reality what I'm doing here is not necessarily a debate. I don't even disagree with him on this topic, as I know, because we have talked a little bit in the comments. But the reason why I'm making this response video is because it's a fantastic opportunity to talk about something absolutely fascinating. Two topics that I love to bits: late Bronze Age cavalry, whether it existed or not, spoiler alert, it did, and the Trojan War and its historicity. So massive thanks to Leonidas Sparta for this opportunity, and let's jump right into it.
This one's going to be interesting. Metatron versus Dr. Ditch himself. I was quite excited to see that he finally brought Roll Canidike up. A good friend of mine and a friend of the channel, you've seen him before.
Excellent historian.
However, I was a little bit surprised when I saw the title of the video, which was that he does not agree with him. And I thought, knowing Roll personally and just genuinely knowing how well versed of a historian he is, I was not expecting at all to see a video where Metatron disagreed with him. So I watched the video with an open mind, and I love Metatron as a YouTuber, one of my favourites. I'm actually a channel member of his.
I confirm that.
It's by no means an attack on Metatron at all, but if I'm being quite honest, I generally really love how pedantic Metatron is. I think that he was a little bit too pedantic in this case and often disagreed.
There is no such a thing.
With Roll a little bit unnecessarily. I'm not trying to accuse him of anything. It felt like he was maybe disagreeing sort of for the sake of it. I'm not trying to speak for what he did, it's just sort of how I felt when I watched the video, which usually I really...
Absolutely valid point of criticism.
Maybe it's my personal bias coming in because, again, I know Roll quite well. There were just sort of a few sections where I was like, I think you're just misunderstanding what Roll's saying here. Sort of one section that I want to touch on, which is a little bit more of my area, well, in this case Bronze Age, but an ancient Greek sort of topic at cavalry.
Freaking love your setup, by the way. The map and the helmet, top notch. Anyways, we are talking about, as you can see, the usage of cavalry in the sense of mounted warriors. There is a reason why I'm specifying this, we'll see that later. But we're talking about the usage of cavalry within armies during the late Bronze Age. You know me, if I think that I said something incorrectly, and I do think that there is one thing that I did say incorrectly in that video, and I will admit that publicly today, if I do think that I say something incorrectly and someone who is making either a response video, a debunking video, a correction video about something I said, I will admit it, no problem, but if I think I'm right, I'll double down, and I did double down on that Testudo, which was one of the two areas of disagreement between me and the statements made by the professor. Link in the description below. But now let's focus on this section about cavalry. Was I wrong or not?
Which is his mention about cavalry in the movie Troy.
In the period where this poem is set, there was no mounted cavalry. And even in later periods, you rarely have people actually fighting on horseback. It's hard to work out how to use cavalry tactically. It's difficult to use it if you don't have very many of them. And horses are just very precious. It costs an enormous amount of money to maintain a horse. So you don't want to waste your horse on something like...
When he says in this period, I wonder what he means exactly. Because, I mean, Macedonian cavalry is a thing.
This is sort of where I wanted to touch on. I think it's quite clear that he is specifically talking about the late Bronze Age, the time of the Trojan War, the time of Homer's Iliad, which takes place around 1200 BC.
Debated. I'll give you the two possible dates, as historians are still discussing on that.
So close to 1,000 years before Macedonian cavalry takes place, and he's absolutely correct in this instance. So in that sense, we don't really see mounted cavalrymen. We do see charioteers.
Okay, before we go into his explanation of the charioteers, which is really well made, I do want to kind of defend my position here. What did I mean and why did I disagree? To further dissect the statement from the historian.
In the period where this poem is set, there was no mounted cavalry.
Already this, I disagree. In this specific period, late Bronze Age, there was mounted cavalry. And most likely, there may have been mounted cavalry specifically in the context of the Trojan War. Not with the Mycenaeans, but with the Trojans. So yes, that's why I found that statement strange, because if you look at, for instance, the Hittite army composition, which we will discuss today, they 100% used mounted cavalry, and they are from specifically this period, which is why I was asking, I wonder what he means with this period in connection with there is no cavalry. That was my question, really, because when you just say in this period there is no mounted cavalry, then I will disagree, because in this period there is mounted cavalry, and there most likely was during this specific war. I'll justify this with the sources in a moment. However, as I always give the benefit of the doubt to any intellectual opponent, if he actually meant that there was no cavalry only with the Mycenaeans, then sure, they would have fielded chariots. But on top of that, listen to this.
And even in later periods, you
Even in later periods,
rarely have people actually fighting on.
you rarely have people actually fighting on horse. He said later periods, which is why I mentioned then the Macedonian cavalry. Of course, I know that the Macedonian cavalry didn't occur in the 12th century or in the late Bronze Age like here, but he did say in later periods. So this is why I was a little puzzled, and then you yourselves, Leonidas, Sparta, tell me, oh, but that only happens 1,000 years after. Oh, yes, but he did say later periods. So that's just to give you context as to why I even mentioned the Macedonian cavalry and why I disagreed with the statement that there was no cavalry in this period. They're both very clear statements, because I know that the historian is really good and very versed. I say, I wonder what he actually meant by this period then, because the two statements taken outside and examined are both incorrect, unless by later period he meant, well, I don't know, what did he mean? Because, yeah, Alexander the Great occurs in a later period. But the Alexander the Great and the Macedonian cavalry, and this is the part that I do admit fault, probably wasn't the best example that I could have used. The Hittite cavalry is the best example that I could have used, which is what we're going to discuss now. First and foremost, the first attestations when it comes to cavalry used in military operations during the Bronze Age have to do with the Hittite war machine when it comes to the Bronze Age. These are specifically identified as a separate type of mounted unit independent from chariots that are used for all sorts of operations. Sometimes for scouting purposes, sometimes for reconnaissance, other times for messages. But of course these three don't matter for the sort of statements that we're making today. Cavalry is also used, however, as an independent corps for fighting, and most likely tactically employed as its own wings, but also in those contexts where geographically chariots wouldn't be used with the same level of effectiveness, terrain being not the only one but one of the factors. But of course at this point you could ask me the question, but Metatron, here we are talking about Trojans versus Mycenaeans. Why are you talking about the Hittites? We understand that the Hittites are in the same period, but aren't these the two factions we are talking about? After all, there were no Hittites in front of the city of Troy fighting the Mycenaeans. But here is the part that I think is the most interesting. There absolutely is a very strong connection between the Hittite army organization and the Trojan army organization. And I will defend this point, but before we jump into the actual Hittite archives and documents, there are a few we're going to explore, we should first explain this point of connection. And in order to do that, we need to answer the following question. Did the Trojan War actually happen historically? In other words, is Troy a real historical city? Obviously, the Iliad is first and foremost a literary text, a production, an epic, and in fact, somewhat a book of mythology. But it is also a historical book. In fact, if someone were to ask me, is the Iliad about historical events or mythology, the correct answer would be yes. The city of Troy absolutely existed historically, and the conflict did happen. Moreover, the connection is the fact that the historical inhabitants of Troy, which would be the city of Wilusa, were vassals of the Hittites. And even though they were a culturally separated reality, they were technically Luvians, and they lived on the periphery of the Hittite Empire, the Hittite Empire had a very strong influence, both culturally, economically, and militarily, with the city of historical Troy. In the book, The Organization of the Hittite Army, written by Richard Henry Beale, he notes the presence of the term in Akkadian Pitallu, and it is found in the text dedicated to the composition of the Hittite armies in the late Bronze Age. Now, the word Pitallu in subsequent Neo-Assyrian documents from the Iron Age clearly indicates the armored and armed horsemen. However, its meaning in the late Bronze Age Hittite context was debated, with some people interpreting it as just being a mounted messenger or perhaps a light cavalryman, a scout. Now, Beale does not only consider the use of mounted messenger, as other authors do, 2 as a weak explanation, but he specifically claims to identify units with the word pitallu consisting of multiple elements within an original core in the documentation. Now, when it comes to the dating, the correct historical dating of the Trojan War, specifically the Siege of Troy, historians and classicists debated, and we do have two possibilities. Either 1334 BC, proposed by Duris of Samos, or 1170 BC, proposed by Sosibius. The site recognized today that represents the hill sung by Homer is the hill of Hisarlik in Turkey. Furthermore, excavations that have been carried out there found some very interesting data when it comes to the archaeological evidence discovered. Now, to defend my position when it comes to the presence of specific military corps of mounted cavalry warriors and horsemen in the context of the Hittite army in the late Bronze Age, we will be reviewing the following data: archaeological goods, literary evidence, and a corpus of documents found in the archives of the city of Hattusha, the capital of the Hittite Empire in Anatolia. And these documents specifically deal with the relationships during the late Bronze Age between the Hittites and a mysterious Western reality known as the Ahiyawa, recognized by scholars as specifically the Mycenaean world. Moreover, it is in these documents that we'll find the final nail on the coffin to corroborate the otherwise single archaeological findings found by archaeologists that help us pinpoint the correct position in time and space of historical Troy, identified as the ancient city of Wilusa. From an archaeological point of view, the site of Homeric Troy, or rather the city that classical scholars have identified with Homeric Troy, is today universally recognized as the hill of Hisarlik in Turkey, excavated between 1870 and 1890 by Heinrich Schliemann. It should be said that the city had gone through alternating phases of abandonment and repopulation, and that at least until the 15th century its location was still widely known, when, according to the Byzantine historian Critobulus, the Sultan of the Ottoman Turks, Mehmed II, went specifically there, to the city of Troy, to celebrate his conquest of Constantinople 9 years after the fact. Now, what's interesting about the way the text presents the event, which is quite propagandistic, this was considered a just retribution inflicted on the Greek for having devastated this Asian city, Wilusa. The various excavation data that has emerged over the years offer at least two strata that could be associated with Troy. Troy 6, dated from 1700 to 1300 BC, or possibly 1250 BC, and Troy 7a, dated between 1300 to 1250 BC, or possibly 1170 BC. Troy 6 is absolutely fascinating with its imposing bastions and its large settlement layout, which could maintain a population able to compete with that of actual metropolis of the period, and it would be compatible with the majestic description that Homer makes in the Iliad, while Troy 7a presents a very interesting widespread ash layer, which is compatible with a fire, moreover related to a whole series of findings that would suggest and indicate an act of war. As a further reinforcement of our historical identification of Wilusa as the Homeric Troy, not only we have evidence that Troy 7a was destroyed by a malicious military-related fire, but Troy 6 was destroyed by an earthquake. I find it particularly significant that the horse that we often see in conjunction with the siege and the destruction of Troy was indeed also a symbol of Poseidon, the god of the seas, but also a representation of earthquakes. Troy existed, and the war surely happened. The Iliad is not mythology. Regarding the documentary and epigraphic findings related to the Bronze Age strata, unfortunately the evidence we have is fragmentary in nature. Therefore, if we want to find writings that narrate the history of the city, seeking a connection with the Homeric epic, we must look to the ancient Near East. In the archive of Hattusha, today found in Turkey, the capital of the Hittite Empire, which during the late Bronze Age was one of the most influential nations, a corpus of 28 texts has been discovered, from which one can extrapolate the difficult relationship between the Hittites and a Western neighbor presented, as we said, with the name of Ahiyawa. Now, the majority of today's historians are inclined to identify Ahiyawa with the Mycenaean world, Ahaioi being the Achaeans, both from the naming conventions of some of its representatives and for the geographical location which, according to the Hittites, would have been, open quotes, beyond the sea, west of the islands off the Anatolian coast. Close quotes. The first relations between the Hittites and the, we'll now call them Mycenaeans, dates back to 1400 BC, when reference is made of a series of Mycenaean raids against the vassals of the Hittites along the coasts of the Anatolian peninsula, and in the island of Cyprus, which were carried out by someone named Atarsia. Now, this so-called Atarsia, or Atarsia, would have arrived in Anatolia with an imposing army, and possibly 100 war chariots. And for the name, a parallel has been proposed with the Mycenaean form of the name of Atreus, the founder of Mycenae and father of Agamemnon and Menelaus, according to the myth. Furthermore, according to specialists, meaning Hittitologists, I can never pronounce that word right, this name in this language is in adjectival form, and the translation would be of Atreus. It's a possessive adjective, interestingly enough, utilized in the exact same way as the Iliad uses the term to define both Agamemnon and Menelaus, of Atreus. If Atarsia's imposing army with its hundreds of war chariots could hardly have been deployed by a single Mycenaean realm, it could be compatible with an alliance formed by different Mycenaean kingdoms, and the connection immediately runs to the catalogue that we find of ships manned by Mycenaeans mentioned in the Iliad. Now, for deeper context, simultaneous with Atarsia's expeditions in Anatolia, we can suppose that the Mycenaeans would also have cultivated excellent relationships with the so-called League of Assuwa, a confederation formed extemporaneously among 22 city-states and small kingdoms of western Anatolia, precisely to stem Hittite imperial expansion. And here is the part that is the most interesting to me. From Hittite contemporary documentations, we know that a king of Ahiyawa, so Mycenaeans, had given his daughter in marriage to a king of the Assuwa League. And moreover, during excavation at Hattusha in 1991, a sword was discovered consecrated by the Hittite king to celebrate his victory over Assuwa, the League, and this is evidently of Mycenaean workmanship. From this moment on, the Mycenaean world would be a destabilizing element regarding the Western Anatolian scenario, functioning as an anti-Hittite force to try to find its own personal space in the Anatolian chessboard. Now, why am I mentioning these 22 cities that belonged to Western Anatolia and this specific anti-Hittite league? Because two of these could be easily connected to cities that are mentioned in Homer's Iliad. According to the linguist Paul Kretschmer, the first to formulate this hypothesis, one of these city-states would be connected to the Ilios sung by Homer, which originally, according to the metric analysis, would have had a name that began with the letter gamma, and instead the city-state of Tarquisa will also find its counterpart in the region of the Troad. The geographical coordinates that can be derived from the Hittite document CTH191 show how the location of Wilusa is largely overlapping with that of Troy excavated by Schliemann. But even though, and this is critical here, initially Wilusa had joined the Assuwa League in an anti-Hittite function, it will subsequently leave it and become a faithful vassal of the Hittite Empire. This is the beginning of the connection between Troy and the Hittite world. So much so that when in 1300 BC a new league of Luwian populations will form to oppose the Hittites once again, in this case Wilusa will not take part and will remain uninvolved. The Mycenaeans at this time will play a crucial role in these wars, supporting rebels coming to directly occupy the Anatolian city of Milawata, or Miletus, in which precisely in this period we have in fact a condensing, we could say, of Mycenaean material in the archaeological record. The Mycenaean world throughout 1400 BC exerts a heavy political and cultural influence on coastal Anatolia. This is proven in the excavation of Hattusha, where a ceramic fragment emerged showing the depiction of a warrior who is evidently Mycenaean, and this, connected with the sword dedicated to the storm god, leads one to consider that within the armies of the Luwian rebels we had either Mycenaean mercenaries or that they had access to some of their equipment. During the 13th century BC, the relationships between the Hittite Empire and the Mycenaeans worsen. We are told about a Mycenaean champion, written in the Hittite records with the name Pia Maradu, which linguists have identified as a transliteration of the Greek name Priam. We are told that in the 13th century BC, Pia Maradu, or Priam, occupies the city of Wilusa, or Troy, and this forced the Hittite king to send an army to reconquer it. Wilusa is cited as the cause of great friction between the king of the Hittites and the king of the Mycenaeans. As described in document CTH74, the Hittite king manages to reconquer the city of Troy, which now was in Mycenaean hands, and as he does that, he re-established the previous monarch and reinstalls them, or reinstitute their vassalage. This is curiously known as the Treaty of Alexandru, which was the name of the Trojan king. At least the aristocrats in Wilusa could have even been of partial Mycenaean origin due to the name, but I won't dive into that too deeply, as here we are mostly interested in the military. All of the events that I've just described, coming from both the archaeological record and all of the corpus of documents that come from these excavations in Hattusha, occurred over a span of 150 years, and it's extremely likely that this was the origin or the foundation of the Trojan War described in the Iliad. I in fact wish to state that the events concerning the relationships between the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, and the Luvians contributed to developing the framework within which Homer, or whoever for him, created the Iliad. Now, for full context, do keep in mind that this is only one of the two areas in which I disagreed with the expert historian, the other one being the part where he talked about the Testudo, and I did double down on that one with this dedicated video. So the historian made some statements when it comes to the Roman Testudo, I disagreed, and then I made a in-depth analysis of the tactical usages of the Roman Testudo to justify my disagreement. Now, what's really fun is that within these 20 minutes and 40 seconds of video, I've only scratched the surface of all the stuff that we have found while researching this topic when it comes to the cavalry usage and in general the army organization of the Hittite Empire. There is really a lot to say. In other words, what I'm saying is that I researched too much. So I've got too much stuff, which means I'm gonna make a spin-off where we actually dive into the full discussion with all of the different papers and documents, all categorized, to give you all of the information I found on the Hittite army composition. And this video will be posted as a spin-off, a part 2 if you will, tomorrow, and it will be titled The Hittite Army Composition. Very creative. Before this video, I want to kind of close it this way. Once again, thank you so much, Leonidas Sparta, for sparking and inspiring this video, the only reason why this video exists. And I even had the idea of talking about the historicity of Troy, the Trojan War, and then the army composition of the Hittite is thanks to you. So I really appreciate your video. Once again, noble ones, go check him out. Excellent, excellent source of information when it comes to anything Bronze Age related, and even more so, anything Greek related. Thanks again, and I'll see you tomorrow. But yes, I stand my ground when it comes to cavalry usage within this period and by the Trojans during the siege of Troy. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much.